You're violating community aesthetics. Karen, it's Halloween, relax. I'll call the police. This is vandalism. That was the moment my HOA president Karen went full psycho over my Halloween display. The 12-foot skeleton, the fog machine, the glowing Jack-O, lanterns, all of it apparently threatened the visual purity of her neighborhood. Hit like if you've ever dealt with someone allergic to fun, subscribe for more stories of neighborhood chaos. Because when she poured acid on my decorations, she didn't know she'd just created the ultimate Halloween villain, me. It all began in the first week of October, when the Florida heat was just starting to ease and the evenings carried a faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. My neighborhood looked like a row of postcards, every lawn trimmed with surgical precision, every mailbox identical, every porch light set to the same sterile glow. I had moved there only 6 months earlier, drawn in by the promise of peace after years of city chaos. What I didn't realize was that behind those spotless hedges lived a woman who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Her name was Karen Livingston, and she wore her title of HOA president like a crown. When the first Halloween decorations started to appear, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe these people weren't as rigid as I thought. The Johnsons down the street had a few friendly pumpkins on their porch. The Garcias had a tiny ghost in their window, and I figured it was safe to start setting up my own display. I had been working on it for weeks, sketching ideas and building props in my garage after work. Halloween was my thing, the one time of year when I could let out my creative side without judgment. Or so I believed. The morning I started arranging everything, I noticed Karen across the street watering her already perfect garden. She paused mid-spray, staring at me over her sunglasses with the kind of expression people reserve for catching someone stealing packages. I gave her a polite wave, but she didn't wave back. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. A few minutes later, she vanished inside her house. I didn't think much of it. Maybe she liked my setup. Maybe she wanted ideas. That evening, as the sun dipped below the palm trees, I found a white envelope taped to my door. Inside was a printed letter on HOA letterhead, written in a tone that managed to sound both polite and threatening. It informed me that my seasonal decorations exceeded acceptable community standards, and that I was to remove or reduce them to ensure neighborhood cohesion. I actually laughed. It was 2 plastic tombstones and a fog machine, nothing outrageous. I shrugged it off, but something about that first letter felt like a warning, a quiet message that my new neighborhood wasn't as friendly as it looked. The next morning, I finished assembling the centerpiece of my display, a towering 12-foot skeleton I had ordered online the previous year, but never had space to use. The skeleton came together beautifully, each joint clicking into place as the morning sun glinted off the white plastic bones. It wasn't creepy, just dramatic, a statement piece that leaned more toward fun than frightening. As I secured it into the soft grass with metal stakes, I felt proud of the result. The fog machine was ready, the pumpkin lights framed the walkway, and the neighborhood finally had something lively to look at. Around mid-afternoon, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching across the lawn. I turned to see Karen approaching, clipboard in hand, her stride fast and determined, as if she had been rehearsing this moment since dawn. Her hair was perfectly arranged despite the humidity, and the floral pattern of her blouse looked like it had been ironed that very morning. She didn't bother with a greeting. Instead, she pointed at the skeleton with her pen and asked what I thought I was doing. I told her it was my Halloween setup, part of the decorations I'd been planning for weeks. She frowned, her nose wrinkling as if the skeleton had offended her personally. "This violates our community guidelines," she announced, flipping through her clipboard with the self-assurance of a courtroom attorney. "Decorations should be tasteful and seasonal. Nothing morbid or overly large. We have children here." I reminded her that Halloween was, by nature, a little morbid, and that the neighborhood kids would probably love it. Her jaw tightened, and she scribbled something onto a form before thrusting it toward me. "You'll receive a citation," she said. "Please remove this immediately." I tried reasoning with her, explaining that the skeleton was just a prop, nothing dangerous or obscene, but it was like talking to a wall painted in pastel disapproval. When she left, she took several photographs of my yard and muttered something about property values. I watched her disappear into her house, the blinds snapping shut behind her like a curtain at the end of a bad play. The skeleton loomed in silence beside me, its hollow eyes reflecting the sunlight. For a brief moment, I imagined it smiling. I had a strange feeling that this was only the beginning of whatever battle Karen thought she had just declared. The following day brought a kind of nervous calm to the neighborhood. The sun rose over the identical rooftops, and the air smelled faintly of citrus from someone's morning cleaner. I decided to test the fog machine before work, just to make sure everything was ready for Halloween weekend. When the mist began to roll across the lawn, soft and white against the grass, I felt like a kid again. The skeleton looked even better, surrounded by that low drift of fog, and the pumpkins glowed faintly in the haze. For a few blissful minutes, everything felt right. Then I heard the familiar click of a phone camera, and the sharp voice that came with it. Karen was standing across the street, recording me from her front walk. She shouted something about air quality and neighborhood safety, waving her phone like it was a badge. I turned off the machine and walked toward her, trying to keep my voice calm, but she was already on a tirade. She said the fog was releasing chemical toxins that could aggravate children's lungs. She accused me of creating a hazardous environment. I told her it was standard water-based fog fluid, the same kind used at school carnivals, but logic had no effect on her. Neighbors began to emerge, drawn by the noise. A few of them looked embarrassed, some curious, and others just amused. Karen continued to record, narrating as if she were a reporter breaking a major scandal. "This man is endangering the community with unapproved substances," she declared. Someone down the street laughed quietly, and I caught the sound of a door closing. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy lecturing me about preserving the neighborhood's natural ecosystem. When she finally stormed back inside, she left behind an awkward silence. I looked at the neighbors who had stayed to watch, offering a sheepish smile. One of them, a retiree named Mike, shook his head and muttered that she had been like this for years. "Don't take it personal," he said. "She just hates anything that draws attention away from her garden." That comment stuck with me. I turned off the fog machine, unplugged the lights, and stood for a long while staring at my peaceful yard. The morning had started with excitement, but now it carried the uneasy weight of a conflict I hadn't wanted and couldn't quite avoid. 2 nights later, I came home from work expecting to relax and enjoy the soft orange glow of the decorations, but something felt wrong the moment I pulled into the driveway. The yard was darker than usual, and the familiar flicker of my pumpkin lights was missing. When I got out of the car, my shoes crunched on something brittle. At first, I thought it was fallen leaves, but as I crouched down, the truth hit me hard. The pumpkins were smashed across the concrete, their carved faces broken into pieces, and their candles crushed beneath the debris. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and burnt plastic, a sharp contrast to the sweetness of autumn. My first thought was kids playing a prank. It wouldn't have been the first time teenagers had taken Halloween too seriously, but then I noticed something more deliberate. Each broken pumpkin had been placed carefully near the sidewalk, as if displayed for effect rather than randomly destroyed. In the center of the mess stood a wooden stake with a laminated notice taped to it. The paper was dry despite the evening dew, which meant it had been planted recently. At the top, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Community Decoration Violation." It was stamped with the OA seal and signed by none other than Karen Livingston. The notice stated that my unauthorized Halloween display had been deemed disruptive and unsightly, a violation of neighborhood standards, and a potential hazard to the property values of surrounding homes. I read the words twice, feeling my pulse climb with every line. Someone had gone out of their way to destroy what I built and then leave paperwork as a calling card. I gathered the remains of the pumpkins in silence, placing them into a trash bag while the quiet hum of sprinklers echoed down the street. The neighborhood that had once seemed friendly now felt hostile, as though every closed curtain concealed a spectator waiting for my reaction. When I finally looked across the street, I saw Karen's living room light flicker. Her silhouette moved past the window, slow and deliberate, like someone making sure their message had been received. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, thinking about the smashed pumpkins, the laminated notice, and the growing certainty that this wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was personal now. The next morning, the sun rose over a scene that looked almost peaceful from a distance, but up close it was clear that something terrible had happened. The grass was scorched in patches, and the melted remains of my decorations glistened like frost on the ground. The skeleton had collapsed, its legs bent inward, and its ribs warped beyond repair. The fog machine sat half-buried in a puddle of what smelled like acid cleaner, its plastic surface bubbling and cracked. For a few moments, I simply stood there in disbelief. It wasn't vandalism by bored kids or a random act of destruction. It was deliberate. Someone had come into my yard and poured acid on every decoration I had made. I called the police before touching anything. While waiting for them to arrive, I noticed faint footprints in the grass near the fence line. They led to the street, where I found the faint outline of tire tracks curving away from the curb. The damage wasn't just physical, it was calculated to humiliate me. Whoever had done this wanted to send a message. The responding officer, a young man named Torres, took photographs and wrote down the details. When he asked if I had any suspects, only one name came to mind. I showed him the previous notices and explained the ongoing conflict. He gave a slow nod, the kind people give when they have already heard the story but are required to listen anyway. "Do you have cameras?" he asked. I pointed to the small security device above my garage. Within an hour, we were watching the footage on my tablet. The recording showed a figure in a hooded jacket moving through my yard at 2:30 in the morning, carrying a large jug and pausing to pour liquid over each decoration. Even through the grainy video, the outline was unmistakable. The posture, the careful way she moved, the short blonde hair visible when she turned toward the light, it was Karen. She worked methodically, checking each piece before moving on, and then disappeared back across the street into her driveway. When the officer confronted her, she denied everything. She claimed she had been cleaning graffiti from the sidewalk and accused me of staging the entire thing for attention. I watched her talk with that same unshakable confidence she carried to every HOA meeting, and for the first time, I understood how dangerous she could be when she believed she was untouchable. After Officer Torres left, I spent most of the afternoon reviewing every minute of the security footage. The camera had caught her perfectly. She came from her side of the street, wearing gloves and carrying a jug labeled industrial cleaner. When the acid hit the decorations, a faint white mist rose into the air, glowing under the garden lights. It was surreal to watch. She moved slowly, as if she were performing a task she believed to be righteous. When she was finished, she looked around the yard one last time, nodded to herself, and walked away. There was no hesitation, no second thought, only certainty. I forwarded the footage to the police, the HOA board, and my insurance company. The email to the board was polite and formal, a far cry from what I wanted to write. I asked for immediate disciplinary action and reimbursement for damages. Within an hour, I received a response from the vice president of the association. It was brief and carefully worded, acknowledging receipt of the footage and promising an internal review. There was no apology, no outrage, no promise of accountability. Just a bland statement that felt rehearsed. By evening, Karen's car was gone from her driveway. I imagined her sitting somewhere, drafting a new version of events that would make her the victim. It wasn't paranoia. She had a talent for rewriting reality. I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the street grow quiet. The faint glow from the damaged yard lights made the melted skeleton look ghostly, a hollow reminder of what had been there. Around 9, I saw movement outside. Karen had returned. She walked up to the sidewalk holding her phone high, filming the ruins of my decorations as if collecting evidence. Her voice carried across the yard, calm and measured. She was narrating her own version of the incident. "This is what happens when unsafe materials are used near residential areas," she said. I realized she was live streaming. I turned on the porch light, stepped outside, and asked her why she was trespassing again. She pointed the phone at me and told her audience she was documenting a hostile homeowner. Her face was illuminated by the light from my porch, pale and expressionless, like someone who had convinced herself she was in the right. In that moment, I understood she wasn't finished. She was just beginning a new chapter in her war against me. When the police returned the next morning, the air in the neighborhood felt heavy, as if the humidity carried tension instead of moisture. 2 patrol cars pulled up quietly, their engines humming while curious neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Officer Torres stepped out again, this time with another officer I didn't recognize. Karen was already waiting on her front lawn, dressed neatly in pressed slacks and a pastel blouse, holding a folder of printed documents. She looked calm, prepared, and strangely pleased, as though she had been rehearsing for this confrontation all night. Before anyone said a word, she began talking, her voice smooth and rehearsed. She told the officers that I had fabricated the video, that I was using digital manipulation to frame her for a crime that didn't happen. She said she had been performing community service, cleaning vandalism caused by local teenagers, and that my camera footage had been altered to make her look guilty. The officers exchanged glances, the kind that suggest skepticism but also a desire to avoid conflict. I handed Torres a flash drive containing the original footage, along with the time-stamped cloud backup. He took it without comment and walked back to the patrol car to verify the files. Karen continued her performance, telling the second officer that she feared for her safety, that I had been harassing her by leaving decorations that were intentionally designed to provoke. She spoke with complete confidence, her words polished by practice. It was impressive in a strange way, how easily she could twist the truth into something almost believable. When Torres returned, his tone had changed. He told Karen the footage was consistent with the version I had provided earlier, and that it showed clear evidence of trespassing and property damage. For a moment, her expression faltered. Then she drew herself up and claimed diplomatic immunity of a different sort, insisting that her actions were authorized by the HOA under emergency beautification measures. The other officer hid a smile. They wrote a report, filed a citation, and warned her not to set foot on my property again. As they left, she called after them, promising to take this to the board and pursue legal remedies. When the police cars disappeared, she stood in her yard staring at me, her face unreadable. The neighborhood was silent except for the soft hum of cicadas. I knew she had lost that battle, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't planning to surrender. The next HOA meeting was held 3 days later in the community clubhouse, a beige building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. I had been to one meeting before, back when I first moved into the neighborhood, and remembered it as a dull gathering about parking regulations and lawn maintenance. This one felt entirely different. People filled every chair, and even those who usually ignored HOA politics had shown up, drawn by the spectacle. At the front of the room stood Karen, poised behind a folding table covered in stacks of paper, a laptop, and a small projector that cast a faint blue glow on the wall. When I entered, a few neighbors greeted me quietly while others looked away, unwilling to pick sides yet. Karen gave me a polite but tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She tapped the microphone and began her presentation with the confidence of someone who believed she was addressing a courtroom rather than a group of homeowners. "This meeting concerns community image preservation," she announced. "Certain individuals have introduced inappropriate elements into our neighborhood, which jeopardize property values and the reputation of our association." Slides appeared on the wall behind her, photos of my melted decorations, the fog drifting across my lawn, and a screenshot of my social media post showing the display before it was destroyed. Her narration was steady and theatrical, filled with phrases like public safety hazard, non-compliance with aesthetic cohesion, and potential contamination risks. She spoke as if she were describing an environmental disaster instead of a few Halloween decorations. When she opened the floor to questions, a man in the back asked why there was police involvement if her actions were authorized. Her smile flickered. She claimed the police had misunderstood, that she was only performing her duties as HOA president. Another neighbor, a woman with 2 children, stood and asked whether Karen was admitting to entering my yard. Karen dodged the question, insisting that she had merely inspected the area. I stayed silent until the murmurs began to grow. Then I stood, holding up my phone with the video ready to play. The projector light flickered against the wall as the footage began, showing Karen in her gloves, pouring acid onto the decorations. The room fell completely silent, except for the faint hum of the speakers. When the clip ended, nobody spoke. Karen gathered her papers, her composure, cracking for the first time, and announced that the meeting was adjourned. After the meeting, the crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. A few people came over to pat my shoulder or whisper words of support, but most avoided eye contact as if taking sides might endanger their social standing. Karen left through the side door without a word, clutching her folder of papers close to her chest. The next morning, I woke to find an email from the HOA board marked urgent. It stated that an internal investigation would begin immediately and that both parties were expected to refrain from further conflict until the matter was resolved. It read like a ceasefire, but I knew her well enough by now to understand that she wasn't going to honor it. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything for my insurance claim. The melted plastic, the warped fog machine, the blackened grass, even the faint chemical burns on the stepping stones. Photograph after photograph filled my phone until I felt like a crime scene photographer cataloging the aftermath of someone's obsession. When I sent the report to my insurance agent, she called within the hour, her voice cautious but sympathetic. "You're sure it was acid?" she asked. I told her yes, and that there was a police report and video evidence. She promised to fast-track the claim. By evening, I decided to take the next step. I contacted a local attorney whose office specialized in property disputes and homeowner harassment cases. Her name was Maya Chen, and she listened without interruption as I explained what had happened. When I finished, she said quietly, "People like this rely on fear and exhaustion. They push until you break. You're not broken yet, which means she's not done." She advised me to file for a restraining order and to demand that the HOA reimburse the damages caused by their president's actions. That night, I drafted the email that would officially start the legal process. I attached in copies of the police report, the video footage, and the HOA correspondence. The subject line read simply, "Property Damage and Harassment by HOA President." It felt cold and formal, but it was the first time I had used her full title in writing, and there was a certain satisfaction in that. After I hit send, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the quiet lawns. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, but I knew peace wasn't what waited for me next. The next morning brought a kind of calm that felt unnatural, the quiet that comes before a storm rather than after one. I had barely finished my coffee when an idea began to form, half born from frustration and half from the strange satisfaction of wanting to turn her obsession into something poetic. Karen had tried to erase my Halloween spirit with acid, so it seemed only fair to bring that spirit back in a way she could never ignore. The thought started as a joke. By the end of the afternoon, it had become a plan. I went to the shed behind my house and began sorting through the storage bins I used for work. My career as a chemical engineer had given me access to more harmless but visually impressive compounds than most people ever see. Over the years, I had helped design luminous materials for theme parks and movie sets, things that glowed under blacklight or shimmered in certain wavelengths. None of it was dangerous. It was showmanship disguised as science. I realized I could use that same knowledge to rebuild my decorations and make them impossible to overlook. Ethan, my old lab partner, and the only person I trusted with this sort of idea, came by that evening. He was the type of friend who didn't need explanations. One look at my yard, and he understood. We worked quietly under the porch light, sketching on scrap paper and testing small mixtures of fluorescent dye in clear containers. When he poured one of the samples onto a piece of gravel and shone a black light over it, the stone lit up like something from another planet. The color wasn't just green, it was radiant, alive, a perfect symbol of what I wanted Karen to see every time she looked outside. We talked about the details, making sure everything we used was safe for grass, concrete, and pets. The idea wasn't revenge in the cruel sense, it was reclamation. She had taken something that brought me joy and turned it into a spectacle of humiliation. I wanted to return the favor in a way that was both beautiful and unmistakable. By the time Ethan left, the first batch of glowing paint was sealed and ready. I watched the container shimmer under the kitchen light, a jar full of future chaos that somehow looked peaceful. It felt like holding justice in liquid form. Ethan returned the next afternoon with a trunk full of equipment from the lab, everything we needed to make the idea come to life. We spread out the materials across my garage floor, carefully labeling each container so that nothing mixed accidentally. The fluorescent solution looked ordinary in daylight, but once the black light hit it, the green turned into something almost supernatural. It glowed softly, like the edge of a lightning storm or the surface of deep water catching sunlight. The plan was simple, but deliberate. We would mix a small quantity of phosphorescent dye with a harmless binding agent that could adhere to surfaces without staining permanently. When dry, it would remain invisible until light of a specific wavelength made it glow. I wanted the effect to be eerie but elegant, something that turned my yard into a living piece of art when the sun went down. Ethan grinned when I explained it. "So, you're turning chemistry into theater," he said. He wasn't wrong. By evening, the garage smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and plastic. We worked methodically, testing small patches on pieces of cardboard, until we found the perfect ratio. The glow was smooth and even, bright enough to be visible from across the street, but gentle enough to fade when the black light turned off. It was like bottling moonlight. The longer we worked, the more excited I felt. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't reacting to Karen's chaos. I was creating something that belonged entirely to me. When the final mixture was ready, we transferred it into sealed garden sprayers. The equipment looked ordinary enough that no one would question it if they saw us working outside. Ethan stood back and examined the bottles with a scientist's pride. "This won't harm anything," he reminded me. "It'll rinse away with water, but it's going to look incredible." I nodded, already imagining the moment it would all come together. We tested a small patch on the back fence, waited for dusk, and then turned on the blacklight. The wood came alive in an otherworldly green shimmer, the kind of glow that seemed to hum quietly against the night air. I felt a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had control again. We spent the next 2 evenings fine-tuning the mixture until it was perfect. The first few attempts had dried unevenly, leaving streaks that looked more like paint than light, but eventually we found the balance. Under a black light, the color flowed like mist. It shimmered when the wind moved through it, soft and ethereal, the exact opposite of the harshness that Karen had brought into my yard. Watching it come to life felt almost meditative. The quiet hiss of the sprayer, the faint chemical scent, and the hum of the generator blended into something peaceful. When we tested the final version, I stood at the edge of the driveway holding the black light in one hand. The fence glowed with a steady green radiance, and the grass reflected a subtle shine that looked almost wet even though it was dry. Ethan walked around with a notebook, recording the temperature and drying time like we were back in the lab again. "It's stable," he said with a grin, "completely non-toxic, and the color intensity is ridiculous." He was right. It looked like the set of a science fiction film. We tried a few playful experiments, coating a handful of plastic leaves and hanging them from a string. When the black light hit, they seemed to float in midair, glowing softly in the darkness. The effect was mesmerizing. For a moment, all the frustration and anger I had felt toward Karen disappeared, replaced by the simple joy of creating something that defied her gray, rule-bound world. By the time we finished cleaning up, it was past midnight. The neighborhood was silent, every porch light turned off, and the moon hung low over the houses. I stood for a long time, looking at the glowing patch of fence. It wasn't just light. It was a symbol of everything she couldn't control. She could send letters, make threats, and twist rules, but she couldn't stop me from reclaiming what she had tried to destroy. When I finally turned off the blacklight, the color vanished, leaving the fence looking perfectly normal. I smiled at the thought of her walking by in daylight, unaware of the spectacle waiting beneath the surface. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep easily, dreaming of green light shimmering across the dark. By Saturday morning, the project had grown from an experiment into something larger. I spent the day rebuilding the display, piece by piece. The skeleton stood again at full height, its joints reinforced with wire, its bones coated in a faint layer of the phosphorescent mixture. The fog machine was replaced with a safer, newer model, and I added subtle blacklights around the yard that would activate at dusk. From the street, it looked simple, maybe even understated, but under the right light, it would transform. As I worked, neighbors passed by, some curious, others cautious. A few waved, though most pretended not to notice. The memory of the HOA meeting still hung over the tender neighborhood like a bad smell. No one wanted to anger Karen, but no one wanted to side with her either. I caught sight of her several times through her window, peering through the blinds, a shape framed by lace curtains. Each time I glanced up, she vanished. It felt like a silent standoff, two people waiting for the other to move first. By evening, the air carried the crisp promise of October. I turned on the lights and waited. The effect was better than I imagined. The skeleton glowed with a steady green hue, its hollow eyes gleaming as the fog drifted around it. The pumpkins shimmered faintly, and the gravestones reflected the light like stone carved from jade. From the sidewalk, the entire scene looked alive, pulsing gently like a breathing organism. Across the street, Karen's porch light flicked on. Her door opened, and she stepped outside wearing a robe and slippers, holding her phone in front of her like a shield. She stared at my yard for several seconds before speaking. Even from that distance, I could hear the tremor in her voice. She demanded that I cease and desist with what she called radioactive decor. Her phone flashed as she took photos, likely for another complaint email. I didn't respond. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, letting the quiet hum of the blacklights fill the air. The children who passed by stopped to stare in wonder, their faces lit green in the darkness. Karen's voice rose, sharp and shrill, but it was drowned out by the laughter of the kids. For the first time since this began, her anger no longer mattered. The night belonged to me. The following morning began with the chime of my phone. Before I was even out of bed, the screen was glowing with notifications from the neighborhood email list. Karen had struck again. The subject line read in bold letters, "Urgent notice. Radioactive materials on display." Her message was written like a public safety alert, warning residents that I was endangering their health by using toxic luminescent substances in my Halloween decorations. She claimed to have spoken with environmental authorities and advised everyone to stay at least 50 feet away from my property until proper testing could be completed. When I opened the message, I expected the usual handful of responses from her loyal followers. Instead, I saw dozens of replies, most of them mocking her. One neighbor wrote that the only thing radioactive in the area was her personality. Another joked about bringing a Geiger counter to the trick-or-treat route. For the first time, people weren't afraid to laugh at her. It felt like the spell she had over the neighborhood was finally beginning to break. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't stop there. Around noon, I saw her walking down the street with a clipboard, knocking on doors and handing out printed copies of her email. She moved from house to house like a political candidate, collecting signatures for a petition she called Neighborhood Preservation Against Chemical Pollution. Most people took the paper politely, but few signed it. The sight of her pacing from driveway to driveway filled me with a strange mix of irritation and amusement. By late afternoon, the local delivery driver stopped to compliment the display. He said he had never seen anything like it, that it looked cool as hell under the evening light. I thanked him, knowing Karen was watching from her porch, arms folded across her chest. The expression on her face was unreadable, a mixture of outrage and disbelief that her warnings weren't being taken seriously. That night, I checked my inbox again. Karen had sent a second email, longer than the first, now quoting imaginary regulations about phosphorescent pollutants and threatening fines of $1,000 per day. I sat back and smiled. The board would never approve it. Every word she wrote only made her look more unhinged. For once, I didn't feel cornered. I felt entertained. The night after her second email, the neighborhood was quiet. A soft breeze carried the faint smell of damp leaves, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of insects. I had just finished adjusting the lights when everything suddenly went dark. The skeleton's glow vanished, the black lights cut out, and even the porch lamps along the street flickered before dying completely. At first, I thought it was a power outage, but the rest of the neighborhood still shimmered faintly in the distance. Only my property had gone dark. I stepped into the yard with a flashlight and followed the extension cords to the outlet near the fence. The plug had been pulled out, and the wires were snipped cleanly. Whoever had done it had used real tools. The cut was neat, precise, almost surgical. My pulse began to rise as I scanned the shadows. For a moment, I saw movement near the hedges, a shape ducking out of sight. I turned the light in that direction and caught a glimpse of fabric floral, familiar, unmistakable. It had to be her. I spoke her name into the darkness, but there was no response. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the creak of a gate closing somewhere nearby. I stayed outside for several minutes, waiting, listening, but whoever had been there was gone. I replaced the cord with a backup and restarted the generator I kept for emergencies. Within seconds, the skeleton's eerie glow returned, casting a pale green light across the yard. When I looked toward Karen's house, her porch light came on. She stood there, framed by the doorway, holding something small and metallic in her hand. Under the glow of the light, I recognized the shape, a pair of wire cutters. She didn't try to hide them. She just stared across the street, expression calm, almost proud, as if daring me to say something. I called the police again, and Officer Torres arrived within 20 minutes. Karen greeted him with a smile and said she had been checking on the power line. Safety, after noticing flickering lights. He didn't seem to buy it, but he still wrote the report with professional restraint. When he left, Karen returned inside, her front door closing softly behind her. My lights stayed on for the rest of the night, glowing brighter than ever, but the uneasy stillness in the air made it clear that this was far from over. The next morning, Officer Torres returned to drop off a copy of his report. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from dealing with the same trouble over and over again. He told me the department couldn't take further action unless Karen damaged something again or trespassed in plain view. Apparently, cutting power cords counted as a civil issue rather than a criminal one. I thanked him anyway and promised to keep my cameras running. As soon as he drove away, I installed 2 new ones, hidden in places she would never think to look. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down, waiting. The lights flickered on one by one, flooding the yard in that now familiar green glow. It looked peaceful, almost magical, but underneath that calm was tension, a quiet knowledge that Karen would return. Around 8:30, I saw her silhouette moving through the shadows near her driveway. She was talking to someone, her voice sharp and hushed. A few moments later, she crossed the street carrying a flashlight and the same wire cutters I had seen before. The cameras caught everything. She approached the side of my house and knelt beside the outlet box. When she tried to cut through the new cable, sparks flew. She jumped back, startled, and cursed loudly enough for the microphone to catch it. The noise brought out several neighbors, including the couple from next door, who turned on their porch light just in time to see her standing there with the cutters in her hand. I stepped outside, pretending to be surprised, and the look on her face was pure panic. Within minutes, Torres was back. This time, he wasn't patient. He took the cutters, bagged them, and asked her to explain why she was on my property after being warned. She tried to smile her way out of it, saying she was helping identify electrical hazards, but her voice trembled. The green glow from my yard reflected off her face, giving her an otherworldly look that even she seemed to notice. When the officers left, she was no longer defiant. She stood in her yard, hugging herself, staring at the glowing skeleton that refused to die. I watched from the porch, the air still and heavy around us. Her war had lost its rhythm, but I could tell she hadn't given up. Some people don't know how to stop fighting, even when they've already lost. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. The usual hum of Karen's presence, the constant sound of her phone camera clicking or her slippers scuffing the sidewalk, disappeared. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. The HOA had gone silent, the neighbors avoided gossip, and my lights glowed peacefully each night without interruption. But silence in this neighborhood never meant peace. It meant planning. By the end of the week, whispers began to drift down the street. Karen had been visiting other houses, talking in hushed tones at their doorsteps, sometimes for hours. I could see her pointing toward my property, shaking her head, occasionally waving around a folder of papers. Whatever story she was telling, it must have been persuasive, because people started looking at me differently again. Some offered tight smiles, others turned away completely. I tried to ignore it, but the tension settled like dust that refused to clear. On Saturday, I woke to the sound of murmuring outside. When I looked through the blinds, I saw a small group gathered across the street. Karen stood in the center like a conductor, gesturing toward my yard while speaking with the calm authority of someone leading a safety seminar. She held up photographs, most likely, screenshots of my glowing display, and talked about neighborhood safety and light pollution. Her performance was practiced and smooth, her tone almost sympathetic, as if she were protecting them from a dangerous experiment rather than a harmless decoration. Later that afternoon, a few of those same neighbors stopped by under the pretense of conversation. One asked about the chemicals I used. Another wanted to know if the lights stayed on all night. Their questions were polite but careful, as if they were collecting statements for her. I answered honestly, keeping my tone steady, refusing to match their unease. That night, I decided not to hide anymore. I turned on every black light, set the fog machine to full output, and let the skeleton's eyes glow brighter than ever. The mist rolled across the lawn, glowing green under the lights, and the laughter of passing children filled the air. I watched from the porch as more people gathered to see. Some smiled, some filmed, and a few even applauded. Across the street, Karen stood frozen on her porch, watching her influence fade in the light she had tried so hard to extinguish. When the officers finally issued the citation for property tampering, I thought Karen might back down. Instead, she doubled her efforts. The very next morning, I noticed the curtains of her front window drawn open wide, and a new camera aimed directly at my yard. It was mounted on a tripod, positioned with the precision of a documentarian preparing for a live broadcast. She wanted witnesses, or maybe she wanted control of the story. Either way, I understood her intent. She was trying to reclaim her power by turning herself into the observer again. I spent that afternoon preparing my final response. It wasn't anger that drove me anymore, but something colder and quieter. Revenge had lost its sting. What I felt now was resolve. She had poured acid on my decorations and tried to rewrite reality. I decided it was time to rewrite hers. I mixed the last of the phosphorescent dye with water, creating a soft, translucent solution that shimmered faintly when the sunlight caught it. It was safe, washable, and completely harmless, yet it carried the same eerie glow under blacklight that had unsettled her so deeply. Just after midnight, I stepped into the street with the garden sprayer slung over my shoulder. The neighborhood was asleep, crickets sang, and the faint hum of power lines filled the still air. I moved quickly, spraying the mixture across her driveway, her mailbox, and the white fence she had bragged about maintaining for years. Under normal light, it was invisible. Under black light, it would transform. When dawn came, I sat on my porch sipping coffee as she stepped outside in her robe. She went about her usual routine, collecting the morning paper and glancing at my yard with practiced disdain. It wasn't until evening that she discovered what I had done. The moment the streetlights flickered on, the front of her house began to glow with a soft, radioactive green shimmer. The color spread across the pavement and up the fence, turning her perfect beige world into something out of a science fiction film. Her scream broke the stillness of the night. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street as neighbors emerged to see what was happening. She stood frozen in her driveway, staring at the glowing stains, while the rest of the neighborhood whispered in awe. I didn't move. I just sat there, watching her realize that she had finally lost control. By sunrise, word had already spread. I woke to the sound of voices outside and found half the neighborhood gathered along the sidewalk. People were pointing, taking photos, and laughing quietly behind their hands. Karen's once pristine house looked like something from another planet. Every inch of her driveway shimmered faintly under the early light, and the residue on the fence glowed when it caught the sunday. It wasn't bright enough to look unnatural, just odd enough to make people stare. Someone joked that her home had been slimed by aliens. Another asked whether the HOA would be issuing itself a citation. Karen emerged wearing oversized sunglasses and a scarf around her head, as if she could hide from the spectacle. She stormed toward her car, only to stop short when she realized the door handles were still covered in the same faint glow. Her hands hovered over them, trembling, before she spun around and spotted me on my porch. I gave her a small wave and took another sip of coffee. For the first time since I moved there, she didn't have anything to say. By mid-morning, a news van pulled onto the street. I had no idea who called them, but within minutes, a reporter and cameraman were setting up across from her house. They interviewed a few neighbors, capturing sound bites about ongoing HOA tensions and an escalating feud turned art installation. One of the reporters asked if I wanted to make a statement. I declined, though I could tell from the smile he gave me that he already knew whose side the story favored. Karen spent the rest of the day scrubbing her fence and hosing down the driveway. Each time she rinsed one section, the light seemed to return elsewhere, faint but persistent, like the ghost of her own perfectionism haunting her. The harmless dye clung to the texture of the wood and concrete in tiny crevices she couldn't reach. That evening, when the sun went down, the glow returned full strength. It spread across her yard like a quiet wave, a sea of pale green light that could be seen from blocks away. She screamed again, this time loud enough to wake dogs and set off someone's car alarm. The glow didn't fade, neither did her rage, and the neighborhood, illuminated in that strange radiance, looked like a living monument to her downfall. By the following evening, the footage was everywhere. Someone had filmed the entire scene from their window the night. Before, Karen yelling at the glowing fence, her slippers sliding on the wet pavement, the eerie green light painting her house like a movie set. The clip spread through social media faster than either of us could have imagined. It began with a local neighborhood page, then jumped to TikTok and Reddit, and by morning it had millions of views. The comments were brutal but creative. People called her Glowstick Karen and the Acid Queen. A few even compared her to a cartoon villain. Reporters started showing up before noon. They interviewed neighbors, filmed my display, and framed the whole story as a battle of Halloween spirit versus Hoey control. The phrase stuck. Within hours, my inbox filled with messages from journalists asking for interviews and photos. I agreed to one brief conversation with a local station, mostly to explain that the glowing substance was harmless and that no one was in danger. The reporter laughed and said it was the best story they had covered all year. Karen refused to come outside, her curtains stayed drawn, and her car never moved from the driveway. The glow had faded slightly during the day, but it still shimmered faintly at night. Each time someone walked by, they stopped to take pictures, their phones lighting up the street like flashes of lightning. The more attention the story received, the angrier she became. Late that night, I saw her outside with a bucket and mop, scrubbing furiously until her arms gave out. By morning, she had only managed to smear the dye across new parts of the concrete. The HOA board held an emergency meeting that afternoon without her. When it ended, one of the members slipped a notice into her mailbox, removing her from her position as president and announcing a temporary suspension from all association duties. I heard the news from a neighbor who smiled as she told me. The same people who had once looked away from her behavior now seemed almost relieved. For years, she had ruled through intimidation. But all it took was a little harmless light to expose how fragile that authority really was. That night, the street was quieter than it had been in months. The faint glow still lingered on her fence, pulsing softly under the moonlight, a reminder that some lessons shine brightest when learned the hard way. When the HOA board released its official statement the next morning, the tone was surprisingly diplomatic. It called the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding between neighbors and emphasized the need for restoring harmony within the community. Beneath the polished language, though, the message was clear. Karen was finished. Her name was removed from every official document and group chat. The board appointed an interim president, a quiet man named Richard, who owned the house 2 doors down. He stopped by later that afternoon to apologize on behalf of the association. His words were polite but hesitant, the kind that suggested he didn't quite know how to navigate the mess he had inherited. I accepted the apology, though what I really wanted was closure. The weeks of harassment had taken their toll, and I felt the exhaustion of someone who had been living on edge for too long. For the first time in months, I spent an evening without checking the cameras or rereading HOA notices. The air outside smelled of rain, and the glow from my decorations shimmered gently in the mist. It felt like balance was returning, even if only for a moment. Across the street, Karen's house remained dark. The blinds stayed closed, and her car hadn't moved since the morning of the board meeting. Neighbors walked past her driveway without speaking, pretending not to see the faint green residue that still clung to the edges of her fence. It was impossible to wash away completely, a subtle mark that seemed to mock her obsession with perfection. By nightfall, she finally appeared. She stepped out holding her phone, scanning the yard as if expecting another ambush. When she saw me sitting on my porch, she froze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The tension that had defined our war seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy but empty. I gave her a small nod, not of triumph but of acknowledgement. She turned away without a word and went back inside. Later that night, I received a message from a neighbor. Someone had seen a moving truck parked near her house. By morning, it was gone, and so was she. The street looked the same as it always had, yet everything felt lighter. The quiet that followed wasn't uneasy this time. It was relief. Karen's departure didn't end the story. It only changed the tone. Within a week, the same local news outlet that had first covered our feud returned for a follow-up. This time they wanted to film what they called the aftermath of the neighborhood's slime war. Their crew arrived early in the morning, setting up tripods along the street and interviewing anyone willing to talk. Most of the neighbors were eager. They spoke about how tense things had been under Karen's rule and how strange it felt to finally breathe without worrying about receiving a violation notice for something trivial. I agreed to a short interview, though I kept it light. I told them the decorations were meant to bring some life to the community and that I never intended for things to spiral the way they had. The reporter asked whether I felt guilty about the glowing prank, and I said that everyone makes their own kind of art. She laughed, writing that line down in her notebook. When the segment aired that evening, the story had been edited with upbeat music and cheerful commentary. They framed me as a kind of suburban folk hero, a man who used creativity to stand up to an unreasonable neighbor. The attention drew more people to the neighborhood. Cars slowed down in front of my house, and strangers walked by to take photos of the glowing fence across the street. The HOA board tried to manage the sudden interest, but even they seemed amused by it. Someone placed a small plastic skeleton near the entrance sign of the subdivision, a quiet reminder of how it all began. Meanwhile, the video of Karen's meltdown kept spreading online. Clips of her shouting at the police and slipping on her glowing driveway appeared in compilations of instant karma moments. She became a symbol of self-inflicted chaos. People started using her name as a verb for overreacting. I didn't enjoy her humiliation, but there was a strange justice in it. By the end of the week, life started to settle again. The decorations came down after Halloween, and the nights grew quieter. Still, every time I looked at the faint green stains left on the pavement, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was closure painted in light. After the cameras stopped coming and the online attention began to fade, the neighborhood found a rhythm again. For the first time since I had moved in, people stopped avoiding eye contact. They lingered on sidewalks, chatted over mailboxes, and treated me like part of the community instead of a spectacle. Even the board softened. Richard, the interim president, invited me to join a committee focused on updating the outdated HOA rules. It wasn't an apology, but it was something close. I accepted, mostly out of curiosity. The first meeting took place in the same clubhouse where Karen had once ruled like a monarch. Without her presence, the room felt lighter. People laughed, disagreed politely, and shared stories about the nonsense they had endured under her leadership. One woman admitted she had been fined for leaving her garden hose in plain view. Another told us she once received a written warning for having a wreath that was too large for the door's symmetry. It was absurd, yet strangely healing to hear those stories out loud. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors stopped to thank me. They said that standing up to Karen had shown everyone that the HOA wasn't untouchable. I didn't know what to say to that. I hadn't done it to make a point. I had just wanted to be left alone. Still, it felt good to see people smiling instead of whispering. A week later, I began repairing what was left of my yard. The grass had grown patchy where the decorations had been, and a few garden lights needed replacing. As I worked, a small crowd of children from down the street gathered at the edge of the lawn. They asked if I was planning another display next year. Their excitement was infectious. I promised them something even better. That night, as I turned off the porch light, I caught the faint shimmer of green still clinging to the pavement across the street. It had faded to a ghost of its former brightness, a soft glimmer that only appeared when the moon was high. It reminded me of everything that had happened, but instead of anger, I felt calm. The feud was over. The neighborhood was quiet again, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like home. Halloween arrived a week later, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt alive. Families who had once kept to themselves came outside to decorate their yards. Strings of orange lights flickered on porches that had been bare the year before, and the air filled with the sounds of laughter and distant music. It was as if the whole street had decided to reclaim the holiday Karen had tried to destroy. I spent the morning setting up my new display, a mix of glowing lanterns, floating shapes, and gentle fog that drifted like mist across the grass. Children stopped by throughout the day to ask questions about the setup. I let them help hang decorations and even handed out small glow sticks as souvenirs. By evening, the street had transformed into something magical. Every house shimmered with light, and the sidewalks were filled with families in costumes. Parents stood in groups, talking and laughing, while kids darted from one candy bowl to another. For the first time since moving in, I felt the kind of warmth that can't be forced by community rules. It came naturally. As darkness settled, my display came to life. The skeleton towered above the crowd, its green glow pulsing softly while the fog rolled around its feet. The kids cheered, and someone started playing music from a portable speaker. The moment felt almost cinematic. People were taking photos, and even the local paper sent a photographer. One of the neighbors joked that the street had gone from the quietest block in Florida to the Halloween capital of the county. I didn't argue. Later that night, a few of us gathered near the cul-de-sac to hand out the last of the candy. Someone mentioned Karen's name, wondering aloud where she had gone. No one knew for sure. A rumor had spread that she moved to another city with stricter housing codes. The thought made everyone chuckle. When the crowd thinned and the lights began to fade, I stood for a long time watching the fog drift across the yard. The air smelled of sugar and pumpkin candles, and somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. For the first time, I didn't feel like the outsider in the neighborhood. The decorations weren't just mine anymore. They belonged to everyone who had finally learned to stop being afraid. A month after Halloween, the decorations were gone, but the traces of what had happened still lingered. The faint green hue on Karen's old fence had finally faded, though under certain light it seemed to shimmer like a memory that refused to leave completely. The HOA newsletter had replaced her usual columns with friendly reminders about recycling schedules and community events. The tone was almost cheerful now, and for the first time, people actually read it. Life in the neighborhood felt different. The sense of quiet fear that once hung in the air had been replaced by laughter, the kind that spilled from open garages and backyard cookouts. The fences that once divided us now felt like boundaries we respected rather than walls we hid behind. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if Karen had ever realized what her obsession had cost her. She had lost control, lost her position, and lost the one thing she valued most, the illusion of authority. One evening in late November, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note. The handwriting was sharp and deliberate. It read, "You went too far, but maybe I did too. Enjoy your victory." There was no signature, but I knew who it was from. I stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to laugh or feel pity. Eventually, I tucked the note into the back of a drawer. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an ending. As winter settled in, the neighborhood lights shifted from green to gold. The holidays came quietly, and people stopped to chat as they strung up decorations. I hosted a small gathering on my porch one evening, just a few neighbors sharing warm drinks and stories. Someone mentioned next year's Halloween plans, and before I could answer, half the group volunteered to help. It made me realize how far things had come. When I looked across the street that night, the house that once pulsed with Karen's energy stood dark and still, waiting for its next owner. The silence around it no longer felt hostile. It was peaceful. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool air on my face, and for the first time since moving in, I believed that the neighborhood, and maybe even I, had finally healed. And that, my friends, is how my HOA Halloween war turned into a neon legend. Sometimes, karma doesn't need to whisper, it glows in the dark. If you've ever had a neighbor try to kill your holiday spirit, drop your story in the comments. Smash that like button for every pumpkin ever wronged, and subscribe for more tales of suburban justice. Remember, decorations can be cleaned, but slime sticks to reputations forever.